You've probably heard this idea a million times. The government should be run more like a business. Cut the ways, boost efficiency, focus on the bottom line. It sounds so simple, right? But what actually happens when you try to apply that logic to an entire country? And that's really the core question we're digging into here, because a new proposal is trying to do exactly that. And it's forcing us all to ask if the rules of a corporation can really work for the massive complexities of a nation. So let me introduce you to the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. This is a brand new initiative with a really bold and, let's be honest, a very controversial goal: to slash U.S. government spending and get the country's huge budget deficits under control. All right, here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll look at the plan itself and the giant number it's up against. Then, we're going to rewind the clock to a time when this kind of thing actually worked, before asking why today is a totally different ballgame. That's going to lead us straight to a major flaw in the math. And finally, what a real path forward might actually look like. So, first up, let's take a closer look at the plan and how people are seeing it. Because, well, when you're talking about this much money, politics are always going to be a huge part of the story. And you've probably guessed it, the coverage is split right down the middle. On one hand, you have left-leaning sources framing DOGE's actions as a threat or even an unconstitutional shutdown. On the other side, right-leaning outlets are using words like shutter and dismantling, really focusing on the mission to fight waste, fraud, and abuse. It's the exact same plan, just seen through two completely different lenses. Okay, so why all the fuss? What is the massive problem this plan is trying to fix? Well, to really get the motivation here, you have to wrap your head around the absolutely staggering scale of the U.S. national debt. There it is, $36 trillion. It's one of those numbers that's so big it's almost hard to comprehend. But that is the total amount of money the U.S. government owes. Now, a number that big doesn't mean much without context. So let's compare it to the size of the entire U.S. economy. That's what we call the debt-to-GDP ratio. And as you can see, the U.S. is sitting at over 117%. For most countries, once you cross that 90% line, you are well into the danger zone. It's a flashing red light for a potential crisis. But here's where it gets complicated. Most mainstream economists argue that the U.S. is, well, a special case. The thinking is that, within reason, it can handle a lot more debt than other countries. This idea of a special status is absolutely central to the whole debate, and it really makes you wonder, is the debt a true five-alarmed fire, or is this more of a manufactured crisis? This idea of tackling the deficit isn't new at all. In fact, we only have to go back a few decades to find a time when the U.S. government was actually running a surplus. Yeah, that means it was taking in more money than it spent. That journey to a surplus kicked off back in 1993 with a big budget act that mixed spending cuts with tax hikes. And guess what? 5 years later, it worked. The government posted its first budget surplus in decades, a winning streak that actually lasted for 4 straight years. So, what exactly is a surplus? It's pretty simple. The government's income was higher than its expenses for that 1 year. But, and this is super important, it doesn't mean the national debt just vanished. Think about it like this. Even if you earn more than you spend this month, you still have your mortgage, right? A surplus just means you didn't add to your debt that year. So that begs the obvious question, right? If it worked in the 90s, why can't we just, do it again? The short answer is that the economic world we live in today is dramatically different. Just look at these numbers. Back in the early 90s, government spending made up about 20% of the economy. Today, it's closer to 35%, and the national debt as a piece of the economic pie has more than doubled. We are just playing on a completely different field now. And these differences have huge consequences. The economy today is way more hooked on government spending. If you just rip that support away overnight, you could spark a major economic shock. And a sudden crash means fewer jobs and struggling businesses, which leads to less tax money coming in, which could actually make the deficit even worse. Okay, so let's get down to the brass tacks and look at the specific numbers behind the DOGE initiative's plan, because this is where we find the real challenge. The goal they've set is to cut $2 trillion from the budget. Not once, every single year. That is a gigantic number, more than 5 times bigger than the cuts from 1993, even when you adjust for inflation. But to really see the problem with that $2 trillion goal, you gotta understand how the federal budget is built. Think of it as two big buckets. The first is discretionary spending. This is the stuff Congress votes on every year, like the military, education, and so on. That whole bucket adds up to about 1.7 trillion. The other, much bigger bucket is mandatory spending, programs like Social Security, which are basically on autopilot, set by existing laws. And this chart really tells the story. About 60% of everything the federal government spends is mandatory. Only about 30% is that discretionary stuff we were talking about. And the rest, that's just interest payments on the debt we already have. And this, well, this is where the whole plan hits a brick wall. The goal is to cut $2 trillion, but the entire pot of money for discretionary spending is only 1.7 trillion. I mean, you could literally eliminate the entire US military, every single federal agency, every road project, and you still wouldn't hit that $2 trillion target. The math just plain doesn't work unless you start cutting into mandatory spending. So, if the plan as it's been laid out is basically a mathematical impossibility, what does a real solution even look like? What can we learn from other places and other ideas? This quote about Argentina is incredibly telling. The country has this long, painful history of radical, whiplash policy changes. And the big lesson there is that constant, drastic shifts just destroy stability and confidence, which are the absolute bedrock of a healthy economy. It's a huge cautionary tale against moving too fast and breaking too much. And all of this leads us to what a more realistic path forward might look like. See, the idea of having a group that oversees government spending isn't the problem. It's the approach. For this to actually work, it has to be slow and methodical. The decisions need to be made by impartial experts, not based on political wins. You have to set goals years in advance so the economy has time to adjust. And crucially, any cuts have to be coordinated with the country's overall economic strategy, not fighting against it. Which leaves us with one final and maybe the most important question. The economic answer seems pretty clear. A slow, steady, coordinated approach is the way to go. But is that kind of deliberate long-term thinking even possible anymore in our world of 24/7 news cycles and deep political divides? Now that is the real $36 trillion question.